All right, agenda item 7 is a discussion follow-up with the Board of Supervisors of Elections requests. And I saw Mr. Kernick in the audience. Welcome, Mr. Kernick.
Thank you so much. Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm Robert Kernick, and I am the chair of the Rockville Board of Supervisors of Elections. I appreciate this opportunity to appear tonight to follow up on the report and the recommendations that the BSE presented to you in October. But before I begin, I do want to mention the other members of the BSE who are here: Steve Fisher, Linda Silversmith, and I think Joe Williams could not be here. I don't see him in the audience. And actually, before I begin, I would like to publicly thank Dr. Alan Chung, who recently resigned from the commission, and Linda Silversmith, who recently announced her intention to resign. They both served admirably, and we were very grateful to have their service. Moving on. When I was here in October, I described to you the two changes that we were recommending to the city charter and the several changes that the BSE was recommending to Chapter 8 of the City Code. One of the things I said to you at that time was that time was short and we needed guidance from you to implement these changes before the election. So I am hoping that we will have the chance to go through these recommendations tonight and that you will let us know tonight which of these changes you'd like to make. Now, when I was here in October, we recommended two changes to the city charter. I recognize that amending the city charter is a lengthy and difficult process. I would be happy to talk about those, but I'm just wondering whether it would be more productive to move on and talk about the proposed changes to Chapter 8 of the City Code. So unless you tell me otherwise, that's what I'm planning to do. Hearing no contrary instructions, then that is what I will do. So let me go through each of these one at a time. Happy to answer questions, but I really hope we can get some sort of guidance tonight so that when going ahead and putting together candidate information packet and getting ready and making all the preparations we need to make, we'll know what we need to do. So let me start with this, and I'll do them just in numerical order if I could. Section 8.1 defines campaign materials to include only tangible items. We would recommend expanding that definition to include websites and emails and other electronic communications, and that would require emails and websites and internet ads to display the same type of disclaimers that pamphlets and flyers are required to contain. I don't think I have the ability to call on anybody.
I'll just jump in there.
Sheila.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Kernick. Just a point of order. So these are not really the code changes themselves. So whatever we decide this evening would then have to go to the city attorney's office. That would then come back with the exact wording, and then we would, at a later date, vote on them.
Yes.
That's the idea.
That's my understanding of the process.
Okay, thank you. As for 8.1, I'm fine with what you suggest.
8.1, I'm fine. 8.1, I'm fine. Thank you, Madam Mayor. 8.1, I am fine as well. I did have a clarifying question because a text message, you could be in a discussion, right? So I would like, as we go to outline this and get more detail, I think there'll be some guidance needed for that.
And absolutely, and my thought is that we would adopt as a model the federal rules on disclaimers. And one of the things federal rules say is that there's no obligation to put a disclaimer on a communication or an item on which its placement would be impractical. So campaign buttons, pencils, T-shirts, hats, I assume text messages as well would not be required to contain disclaimers.
You may be thinking what I'm thinking, but it does include text messages here as a campaign material, so it just means that it's considered a material, but maybe the full disclaimer may have to, not be there. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that if it's a part of a conversation, my understanding of the federal regulations is there's no disclaimer. On the other hand, if you're using text messages as a campaign tool, let's say
Right.
geofencing, for example, where everybody who crosses the boundary gets a campaign message, then that may require a disclaimer.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Feinberg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the reason I put my hand up is with the disclaimers. I was surprised to hear you say T-shirts because, to the best of my experience, we have always had disclaimers, the authority lines on our T-shirts, and even if you changed treasurers, you had new disclaimers put on them. So I was surprised to hear you say that, and similarly for buttons.
Well, all I can say is this afternoon, preparing for this, I pulled out my handy guide to the federal rules on disclaimers. And at least under federal law, my understanding is the disclaimer is not required on T-shirts and buttons. If you decide that you want them to appear on T-shirts and buttons,
do
then to
that.
be sure, you have that authority.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And as Councilmember Pichelle said, when it comes back, we can amend the language.
Okay, nothing further, I'll move on. Okay. Section 841A says on election day there will be a voting center, one voting center, and it will be at City Hall. We would like to open a second voting center. We'd also like to place additional ballot drop boxes around the city. Our proposal is that the second voting center would be at the Thomas Farm Community Center. At least initially, we were thinking that the 3 additional drop boxes would be at the Montrose Community Center, at the Senior Center, and at the Lincoln Park Community Center. Thomas Farm and Montrose Community Centers are in areas of the city that had the lowest vote turnout in the last election. The drop box at the Senior Center would make it easier for seniors to vote, and we absolutely positively wanted to put a drop box on the other side of Rockville Pike, which we thought could be put at the Lincoln Park Community Center. Now, if I could anticipate your question.
Well, I sent it to you in advance.
You did. So I'm ready.
I really liked that you are expanding access because everyone has different mobility concerns and ability to travel. So I like that you're putting additional access points in other parts of the city. So I just want to say thank you for that recommendation. I did send a question in advance and had a chance to talk to our DCO lead about adding Twin Brook because I did see that as a major area, and having done some community meetings there in the past with parents and families and other people, hearing that transportation can be an issue. So I think that would be a really good space. We have a recreation center there. I also know that it could be staffed in a secure location. So I wanted to add that.
And I think that may be a very good idea.
And when the language comes back, perhaps we can be specific about where we're putting them, or numbers, or just at least the numbers, because you may modify it over time.
As you pointed out, a lot of this has to do with logistics. So on Friday, Sarah Taylor Farrell and I met with officials at the Montgomery County Board of Elections and discovered, to our surprise, that indoor drop boxes were in short supply, which was not what we were expecting. So then we have to ask ourselves, okay, how many do we have? How many can we get? Where can we put them? What's the surveillance like? If they're outdoor, you need 24-hour video surveillance. Indoor, we have maybe more flexibility if you can put it next to somebody like the information desk at the senior center but then they're only open while the center is
That's right.
open. So there are a lot of sort of logistical things to balance, but I have absolutely no objection whatsoever to having a drop box at Twinbrook.
And to Councilmember Ashton's point, Mr. Kernick, I'd love to see in the legalese when it comes back to us as an ordinance that we specifically name the places that we're going to have the boxes. I think that would be very helpful just going forward.
Okay.
Councilmember Feinberg, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with that, as well as specifying where the second vote center would be, so that at least when it comes back to us, if we need to tinker it once we have it, but at least we have something in front of us. And I would definitely echo that we added for Twinbrook a drop box.
Okay.
Councilmember Fischel.
Yes, also supporting a drop box at Twinbrook.
Okay. And if there are no other questions, I will move on. Section 841C says that prior to election day, the BSE will mail one notice to every household in Rockville, and then 3 separate notices, one to each registered voter in Rockville, reminding them of the election deadline and how and where they can vote. I think 4 mailers made sense in 2019 when Rockville was conducting its first vote-by-mail election, but our view is that 3 mailers would be, and one to all households, and then 2 to each registered voter would be adequate this year. 2 points about that: it would save, I think, at least $20,000 in postage and printing, probably something more than that. I think the postage is almost $20,000. And that might defray in part or in whole the cost of the second vote center. The other point is that by the time the 4th mailer goes out, the ballot packages are at the vendor, ready to be mailed out. So it may serve as a reminder, but it does nothing whatsoever to help clean up the voter database, because the packages have already been addressed. So we think a good idea would be to reduce by 1 the number of mailers that are sent out.
Councilmember Feinberg, then Councilmember Ashton.
Thank you. So I am okay with reducing it by number of 1, but one of the items that you just mentioned was something I was going to say globally.
Councilmember Feinberg, are you speaking? Because I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I did not hit I didn't hit my little red button there. I apologize.
That's okay.
When you spoke a minute ago about saving approximately $20,000, it was one thing. I am in favor of reducing it by 1 to a total of 3, but I don't think what we have seen, and for the public who we represent, and we're all want to be fiscally prudent, we haven't seen at all the projected a line item budget for this election. So I'm going to ask that we receive a line item budget, the total costs, both the staff costs, the personnel costs. If you're going to a second vote center, there will obviously be costs there, because you're going to have some election judges there, that's clear. You're going to have some training sessions for election judges, so that we really see the full array of costs, including these drop boxes. You know, everything is there, printing it, because by now you know the mailing costs.
Well, some of that is a little premature without knowing what we can get from the state via the county. So we can't put a cost on something until we are confirmed what we can have and the materials. Training will be very minimal, because the only training that we'll be doing will be on we're going to ask for this time to have what we call our check-in for voters, and we are manning the center with the same employees that we're going to hire to do our intake process and at the counting center. So we're just kind of waiting to see what that's going to look like after we finalize our locations and all. But drop boxes and stuff are going to be given to us as a gratis from the county to use.
But all elements, if we can receive that, I don't know when the timing is that you will hear from the county what the cost will be, but so that we can share that we have it and that our residents know the cost of this election.
Yeah, we have a preliminary of now what the cost will be, but after tonight, adding these additional, we'll be able to go back to the county and see what that
Great.
cost will be.
Great, that would be great if that can be transmitted to everyone. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Ashton.
Thank you. I had some questions about this one, and I shared that with you as well.
Yes.
So can you just, for the public's sake, just speak to what is the content that you including in each of the 3 mailers, and what's the 4th content that would be not included?
The content is actually dictated by the statute. So, and I should remember this, but it's when the vote is, where you vote, what the deadline is, who you'll be voting for. But, and I think, as you know, it's a little bit more complicated this year, and actually there's an additional cost because all the mailers will be in English, Spanish, and simplified Chinese. We're also including a QR code that will produce a translation in French. But what I would say is that I'd have to look back at the mailers from 4 years ago because the content will be essentially the same because it's dictated by the law.
Yes, and in addition to the ballot itself.
The ballot itself will be in English and Spanish. We are not planning for the ballot itself to be translated into other languages, but let me say why. One of the things that I read when I first got this job, and Sarah sent me a little manual on ballot preparation, which is a whole area in and of itself, is that it's a mistake to make the ballot too long. That if it looks like a book, you discourage people from voting. But we do publish a voting guide. And our plan is for the voting guide to have translations of the ballot into other languages, including simplified Chinese.
So I want to thank you for adding simplified Chinese. I think as a candidate, I had requested something like this and it wasn't possible the last time. So I think it is absolutely essential that we try to reach more people in our community, especially looking at the demographics that we are, thinking about who we serve.
And our efforts are not stopping there. We are also recruiting, taking advantage of the county's program that recruits bilingual high school students to work at the voting centers, so that we will have people there who can assist people with limited English proficiency be able to vote, navigate the process, and answer their questions.
Thank you. Well, you just jumped ahead to my next comment, is bringing in students. So if you are I have mixed feelings about, I do think reminders are helpful. People sometimes forget and they're like, oh, I have that ballot. But what are some ways, or perhaps think through some ways that you can help make up for that? So last year you put some yard signs around communities. Maybe there is social media that is reaching the various districts. I just want to make sure that there's a plan to find ways to remind people, because people do forget that ballot is in their pile.
I will tell you that 4 years ago, I think we did a yeoman's job of publicizing the election. We had a van that rode around the city. We put up huge banners in the middle of downtown. We had a display at the library. We visited homeowners association. Anything we could think of, we did. So I think, I'm hoping that we get to do all of those things again. And if anybody has additional ideas, we had a lighted road sign on Falls Road at some point and other places around the city. We were at every public event with a table telling people we're going to conduct our vote by mail this time. So there's a lot we can do and a lot we will do.
Councilmember Pacheco.
And let's not forget that by the time the election happens, there's there's probably 4,000 or 5,000 yard signs around the city too.
Yeah,
That,
right.
they remind people of the election. You know, people, I don't think the problem was people weren't aware of it. There may have been some, but it's, you know, it's whether they see it in their interest, and that's a salience question. But nevertheless, thank you for that. You know, in my campaign website, I had 15 languages. I think that's great. It's not that expensive to do necessarily, so.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I'll move on to the next item. Section 845 says prohibits electioneering within 50 feet of a voting center, and we recommended amending that section to prohibit electioneering within 50 feet of a drop box. And that's a very specifically to address a safety issue that arose 4 years ago. People were campaigning in front of the drop box in the parking lot at the same time cars were riding by, with people dropping off their ballots. It was a safety issue, and we'd like to be able to tell people that no, you cannot electioneer near a drop box.
Councilmember Feinberg, and then Councilmember Pershela, and then Councilmember Dr. Miles.
Yeah, thank you. If you can remind me, not in regard to the ballot drop box, but in regard to generally the going into where you vote, I thought that had a standard of 100 feet. There used to be a marker that was put up.
Well, I could look.
Was it 100 feet?
Was it
Ms.
100
Farrell?
feet, 845?
From the door and the entrance, 100 feet, but this is additional to where the
No.
drop box is being placed.
No, I understand. I was looking for consistency and wondering whether the 50 feet was too little, and should it be more like 75 or 100 feet? That was really where I was heading.
Well, the statute actually says 50 feet, but if you wanted to increase that number to 75 or 100, we would certainly have no objection.
Okay, well, we can see when it comes back,
Okay.
but to consider
Councilmember
that.
Pershela?
Yeah, I totally agree with having that area. I will say that 4 years ago, I think somebody in the car couldn't reach the drop
Right.
box and asked me to put it in for them, and that happened. So you know, there are those situations too, and some of these people can't really get out of the car. So that's why she asked me to do it.
Councilmember Dr. Miles?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I had a comment about the last point in this one. So with regard to this one, it does make sense to remove or ban electioneering near the drop box as well. What I was going to say about the previous item, which was reducing the number of notices, I personally prefer just keeping them as they are, although there was a significant increase in voter turnout from 20, I guess it would be 2015 to 2019. It's still, I think it's only about 25%, so anything we can do to get the word out. I'm supportive of, even at cost, recognizing how expensive mail is. That's all I have. Thank you.
Councilmember Dr. Miles, I'm glad you said that, because when I was reading through this, and I wasn't going to say anything tonight because it looked like I was maybe not in the, not that I care but whether I'm in the majority, but I just decided not to make waves. But I think we have new people in the city. And so, you know, I would like to know if staff has any idea what our increase in population is from 2019 to 2023, to know whether that fourth mailing would really be helpful. I don't think you could do too much, and I know we really struggled last time to get the fourth one. I think I would leave it in there as well, for the reasons that you mentioned. You know, let's just get as much information out there. Councilmember Ashton.
Thank you. Sarah Taylor Farrell wanted to speak first, I think, to clarify one thing, and then I'll go.
Yes, in 2019, we had 39,395 and 12,287 voted. As of December 2022, we got 48,049 on our registered voters. And that may drop between now and then, before November.
So the comment I was making
Also-
before, oh, sorry.
Sorry. Also, we just need to know how many feet to bring back. Are we going to put a number of 50 or 75 or 100 for electioneering
Yep.
for both sign and drop box?
Thank you. So I was making the comment about the mailer before because I did see that and talking to people, despite all the yard signs, that was a nice reminder. Also, we have people who live in apartment buildings who are not exposed to yard signs the way all of us, not everyone sees the same thing depending on where you live. So it seemed like a worthy opportunity, given our success in increasing the metrics and getting more voters to turn out. In relation to the 50 feet, I think if anyone needs help putting their ballot in the drop box, I think that's a great opportunity for a student to help or a volunteer, just to keep things clean. I was thinking about the tightness of the space. Just remember, being out there last time, 50 feet seemed like it put you at the sidewalk in a way. I know that Sarah was coming out and measuring things, so I don't know if 100 feet would put you like down the block or like across the street.
100 feet would probably put you across on the other side of the street from the drop box here.
So, yeah, just because it's a tight space here. So that's why I thought you had the 50 feet, and I was fine with that. But I do agree that we should have a safe place around the drop box.
Councilmember Feinberg.
So I think I would suggest it comes back with 50, and when it does, we can look at it, have that discussion, and see where we go. And maybe in the interim, if you could look at the potential of where 50, 75, or 100 would be for the city hall and for Thomas Farm. You have a little time. That might help the conversation.
Councilmember Pershela.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would suggest on the mailing, the number of mailings, that if we do a fourth mailing, it really be treated merely as a reminder and not as a way to clean up the voter list by that time. And maybe just be a little simpler to produce and get out.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
We just wanted to be reminded that postcards are 48 cents versus 44 cents that we had in 2019. We were planning to do door knockers as part of our communication. That would probably help with a lot of that fourth mailer communication as reminders.
And I really think that's a good point. That might be more effective than a mailer, and yet another mailer, putting the door hangers.
Councilmember Ashton and then Councilmember Pershela.
Would you be able to get into apartment buildings with this?
Maybe not. As I think everybody here knows, getting into apartment buildings is a challenge. It is a challenge not only for us, but of course for candidates too. And if you folks want to enact a law granting us access to private property, please go ahead. But otherwise, I just don't know how we can get into apartment buildings when the owners are excluding us.
Councilmember Pershela.
Yeah, thank you. I asked this question a few months ago, and I was told, whether it was an email, I can't remember, but I was told that during the census, we were successful in getting into the apartment buildings and that we would have the same idea for the election itself. And I believe that there's communications made with the management companies of these apartment buildings. And we actually have a list of apartment buildings.
Yes, I'm working with Harmon Cordero on that, and that's why we're coming up with the door knockers. And he did say that there are some private apartment complexes that he's working with that we can get in. We can't guarantee all of them, but there are a few on the list that we can.
And just out of curiosity, what's the timing of the door hangers?
I don't know.
We could use that as part of the fourth mailer reminder in between that third and fourth reminder.
Yep. Because it wouldn't do anything to clean up the voter rolls anyway. So,
No,
right.
it would just be as a reminder.
I'm just gonna say, I'm not sure what I think about door knockers. That's a lot of footwork for staff, a lot of staff time away from the office. You know, I just don't know who does all that. Is it volunteers? Is it students?
It's,
And how do you track what neighborhoods have been done and haven't been done? So I just need more information on that part of it.
well, we're working with our communications and we can give you a layout of that, but they did it for the census and it worked very well. And a lot of the neighborhoods, we are planning to have volunteers of students for student service learning hours and also homeowners association groups, whoever we can get as, to help us in the community.
Councilmember Ashton.
I did door knock for the census as well, just to help get the word out where there were communities that had less response. It does take a lot of time, and you'd have to have a very coordinated, like, student response to make sure that everyone is reached equally, so and that there's not neighborhoods that are being left out.
Councilmember Pershela.
Yeah, when we did door knockers on the I-270 issue, we managed to get out about 15,000 door knockers, and it wasn't really any kind of problem to keep track of which neighborhoods. You know, we didn't do all neighborhoods, but we certainly knew which ones we wanted to do and which ones were done. So that wasn't that big of a deal.
Okay, not hearing anything else, I'll move on to number 5, which is Section 872A, which talks about slates. We recommended amending that section to say that slates can exist only for a single election cycle. And actually, I could address a question that Council Member Dr. Miles asked me when I was here in October, which is there a definition of what an election cycle is? And as I discovered getting ready for this evening, there is. It's Section 878F, which says an election cycle is from January 1 of following a general election until December 31st, 4 years later, following the next general election. That's how the code defines an election cycle. And the logic here is that Rockville elections are supposed to be nonpartisan, and it was our observation that slates that function as continuing political committees in some ways operate like political parties and make Rockville elections more like partisan elections. So the solution that we are recommending is certainly not to eliminate or prohibit slates, but simply to say that that they are prohibited from operating as continuing political committees, which means that if there are surplus funds at the end of an election cycle, the surplus funds have to be dispersed. They can't be carried over to the next election cycle.
Councilmember Pershela.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Dr. Kernick. I really have incredible issues with this. And just so everybody knows my involvement in slates, I'm the one in 2013 who recruited people and formed Team Rockville, which then ran in 2015 and 2019. And I have big problems with this for a variety of reasons, but I'll first draw your attention to Rockville Code Section 8.1, the definition of a political party. A political party means a party, any of whose candidates for presidential elector received votes in either of the last 2 preceding elections at which presidential electors were selected. Political party shall include all national, state, county, and local chapters, divisions, and affiliated organizations. So in the city code itself, there's very definitely a definition of political party, and it certainly doesn't touch what a slate has been. I then went to Eileen McGucking's book, and this is Portrait of a City, and which incredibly well done book, and I will read you from page 138, the second column, second paragraph, and this is regarding what I believe was the first slate in Rockville. And I'll quote from the book, "A huge advertisement in the Sentinel on February 4th, which would have been in 1954, announced the birth of a new, quote, nonpartisan political group," end quote. And now, end quote, the book itself there. So in that birth of the first slate in Rockville, the term nonpartisan political group was used. I have to believe, I didn't have a chance to read her whole book, but I have to believe that phrasing was specifically crafted to distinguish between what I think is really meant by a political party, and that would be national political parties or even state level political parties perhaps. Later in the book, just on a scanning, there's mentions of several other slates, some of which lasted more than one election cycle. Some just were there and then disappeared. Then I went, just did a search on freedom of association, just that phrase, and I was looking for national interpretation that, and what I found very quickly was that the term freedom of association derives from the First Amendment of the Constitution, explicitly of the 5 freedoms mentioned in that First Amendment, speech, assembly, and petition together, have been cast by the courts, according to my reading, as defining a freedom of association. So, without getting too political about it, in 2013, I approached a few other people to form the slate, and all 3 of us had run in elections in 2009 and 2011, beating up on each other and other council member candidates. And in 2013, I approached them. I said, "Look, we've been campaigning against each other, but we felt that previously in 2009 and 2011, we had been running against what I term as shadow slates. So we observed other candidates that were cooperating even in debates and putting out lawn signs and things like that. And so when we decided to form a slate in 2013, we said, okay, we're going to be totally transparent, and that's what we have been. Now, full disclosure, we did formally close Team Rockville a few months ago. Over $700 went to the Casement Mansfield's Clinic, and that was how we handled it. But nevertheless, what I find is, and what we said in our dissolution statement, is that we formed the slate at that time because we observed that there are political structures that are not announced in the city that are performing as, that have a point of view. And that, when we formed a slate and carried it over for 3 elections, we were being totally transparent. So, if we have to end a slate after 1 election cycle, that doesn't stop, for example, people from reforming it the next election cycle. Things like maintaining a website. So, that expenditure to maintain a website could be between election cycles and between formal declarations of a slate. And then all of a sudden, you're expending money that you don't have to account for. So for those, I just think it's dodgy legal reasoning. I think there are problems with it. And, so for that reason, I just don't think this should be in here. I think it confuses what is meant by a political party and a political committee. They operate totally differently, but yet I should have the freedom to associate with anybody I want and spend money to do that. So thank you.
If I could just briefly respond, I do want to clarify that we are not suggesting that a political slate in Rockville is a political party. And I am certainly not suggesting that there is anything wrong with forming a slate or reforming a new slate for each election. But what we are saying is that the process of raising money that you hold on to and use from election to election to election is allows a slate to, in a sense, operate in some ways like a political party. And that the better course would be to require people to reform the slate, to dispose of the excess money if there is any, and then to reform it to form a new slate for each election. And I understand you disagree.
No, I more than disagree. I think this is actually something that we should be referring to the city attorney's office for an opinion, because when I read the city code on what a party is, it's far, far different than what any slate in the history of Rockville, starting with Citizens for Good Government in 1954, has ever been. And I think it's really shaky political ground, shaky legal ground. That's my reading of it. So I do object to that even being in there.
Councilmember Ashton.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for being brave enough to talk about the issue. I know it's not easy.
I've had people yell at me
No,
before.
that's
It's
okay.
perfectly
I know
okay.
you're a volunteer, and I just want to say thank you because I think it's an important discussion to have. I do think it's worthy for our city attorney to weigh in and share some feedback from someone who was a new candidate. And hearing potential candidates, people feel like they have to slate up to survive and to make it. And I understand how some people can feel if they're not on the slate. So I just think it's an important conversation for our city to have. And I welcome the legal opinion of our city attorney.
Councilmember Pershela.
Yeah, sorry if anybody thought I was shouting at them, because I didn't. All right. But Councilmember Ashton raises a very good point, which I didn't address, and that is, if you look at the last election, the council candidates who were not on the slate all finished behind council candidates who were on a slate, one of the two slates. And the vote by mail, which was hugely successful, not only increased costs for the city, it doubled or tripled at least the cost for council candidates and mayoral candidates. And really,
Yes.
so then, you either are independently wealthy and have the funds and the means to make yourself viable, or you join a slate, or you don't have much of a chance, though it could happen. So the other thing I want to say is that when you make a slate reform and all that kind of stuff, it's actually a fairly hefty process, and that you are then forcing that slate, that point of view, to go through a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have to keep doing. And it gets into a whole lot of things, like I already mentioned websites, but emails, Facebook pages, things that you subscribe to, things like that. I think you're making it way too hard for that. So anyway, I think it's really dodgy, and I think slates are here to stay, because in 2013 we needed to pool resources. We didn't have any choice.
Mr. Koenig, thank you for having this conversation, and I do agree that we should get the opinion of the city attorney. Can you share with the mayor and council where the BOSC came up with this idea, or what you're hoping to address by this recommendation?
Well, it actually, and I've forgotten when it was probably at least a year ago, we had a long discussion among ourselves about the role of slates. And it began by somebody asking, well, if there's a financial obligation that, let's say the slate takes a loan, whose obligation is it anymore to pay that obligation? And from election to election to election, whose obligation is it now to file campaign finance reports on the part of the slate, particularly if the composition of the slate changes? So after a long discussion, and in which people weighed in, we thought, the process would be, I think, more straightforward, more honest, more fair, if in fact there were not these sort of continuing political entities that finance elections from one election cycle to another. And I understand this is a controversial subject, and I agree with you on both that it warrants discussion and that it would be good to hear from the city attorney on the legality of this proposal.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Prashela.
Thank you. I certainly agree from experience that how you handle the carryover needs to be clarified, and especially loans, I think needs to be clarified. I totally agree with that part of it, that, setting reasonable rules on those kinds of things, it makes a lot of sense. I will say that I won't share our bylaws, but the bylaws we had for Team Rockville spoke to those very issues. And, we always managed a treasurer, and we always, I think, were very clean when we went from election cycle to election cycle. We didn't carry a lot of money. It wasn't tens of thousands of dollars between each election cycle. But nevertheless, I think that part of it does need to be cleaned up. But that still doesn't speak to some of the other issues of it takes a lot of work to start a slate, and all that goes with it. So I think I really do think you're just asking for lack of transparency if people are making, subscriptions for slate names when there's not an official slate. That doesn't have to be reported, but yet it was a payment that somebody made, that kind of thing.
I understand. Okay, well, the good news is this next suggestion is much less controversial. And that is, Section 874A says that campaign committees must pay all expenditures by check. That seems a bit out of date to us. We would amend it to say that campaign committees can pay their expenses by debit card or credit card or other electronic means. I note that the code says that you can make contributions by debit card and credit card, and it seems to me people ought to be able to pay their expenses in the same way. Okay, well, that was a lot easier. All right, number seven, 877B says that, and this addresses your comment, Councilmember Prashela, that loans to campaign committees require written consent, but it doesn't really address in any way loans from a candidate to the candidate's own committee or loans from a candidate to the candidate's slate. And what we would suggest is clarifying it to say that if a candidate makes a loan to the candidate's own committee, there's no reason for written consent. But that if there is a loan from the candidate to a slate, that does require the written consent of the slate, because presumably it imposes the financial obligation to repay on the other members of the slate, on the entire slate. And if the loan is not repaid, then those members of the slate have a continuing obligation to file campaign finance reports. So since by accepting the loan they are accepting those obligations, we think written consent would be appropriate.
Councilmember Prashela.
Yeah, as one who has made many loans to the slate, I don't object to that at all. I think that's fine, but I think also the loan can be written in terms that if the money's not expended, it goes back to the person who made the loan in the first place. And
I can't think of a reason why that wouldn't be appropriate.
right. So I mean, I certainly within the last election period got back some money that I loaned. And, we did it legally, we did it by vote and that kind of stuff. But I have no objection to clarifying that. I just think, I think the language has to be clearer than what you stated to say that it's the candidates on the slate. It wasn't very clear who this was targeting.
Interestingly, it's actually stated on the campaign finance reports, but I'm really uncomfortable with having statements on the reports that aren't based on language in the statute. So I think we need to make the statute say what we want it to say, and so that's why we're making
Yeah,
this
thank you.
suggestion. All right. 878D says that no person may contribute more than $2,000 in the aggregate in any election cycle. You know, I like that provision, but the Supreme Court doesn't. And in 2014, McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, Supreme Court essentially said that aggregate contribution limits are unconstitutional. So I think you ought to delete that section from the code. Okay. And Section 881A permits candidates to file campaign finance reports either electronically or by hand. We recommended amending that section to say that all CFRs, campaign finance reports, must be filed electronically. I would say in the last election, every candidate filed electronically, and if you want
No,
to.
go ahead. No,
Okay.
respectfully. I wasn't called on, so I'm waiting.
I know that Councilmember Ashton expressed some concern about candidates who might not be computer literate, may have difficulty filing electronically, and you may be absolutely right about that. Although I think our experience is that the reports are actually filed by campaign treasurers, and I would be quite surprised if someone had as their treasurer somebody who wasn't computer literate enough to file a report electronically. In my real job, I do file campaign finance reports in various states, and I know that every state now requires them to be filed electronically. We would make it mandatory, but I have to admit, I don't think this is the most important proposal we have here tonight.
Councilmember Feinberg and then Councilmember Ashton.
Thank you. So when I read this, first I want to acknowledge the campaign finance reports for the 2019 election. Hats off to you all, Ms. Farrell. It was so much better than previous years. So much easier to complete either as a candidate or treasurer, and the back and forth to submit it. It was 1,000% better. So first of all, let me acknowledge that. It was great. My concern with this is trying to think about real life. You're pressed, you have to submit that thing that night. Yes, you shouldn't wait to the end, but you know people are really busy during campaigns. A computer could be hacked that you couldn't do it. There could be a power failure that prevents you, that's out of your control. Or a personal emergency. Life happens. And so what I was going to suggest, I understand the spirit of this, but that perhaps there could be a waiver, if it's brought back to us, that could be granted by the BOSE due to exigent circumstances. And that would be kind of accommodating things that could happen, but that it's not a rule, and the BOSE would have to determine.
Well, to that point, I think the statute gives the BSC the authority to waive late fees. And having said that, late fees are very, very rare. And and I won't describe the process, but if it doesn't come in, people are entitled to notice, they get an additional period of time to file. We call them up, or have staff call them up and say, what's the problem? Let's try to walk through it. So we try to be as reasonable and accommodating as we can.
So I appreciate that, and having served on the BOSE for almost 7 years, I saw that and we accommodated. But I'm looking for it to be as something specific in the ordinance. Why guilt people? They could be going through a crisis. It could be beyond their control. I understand the accommodations, but you also have to look if it's not in the law. There could be different members on the BOSE who wouldn't be as accommodating. And so it's only if you have that law in front of you that it's on your side.
Okay, although we're all pretty reasonable.
Well, I know you all are, but I mean, you know, it's like anything else. People turn to what does the law say?
Yes.
And that's the spirit of it.
I support Councilmember Feinberg on this one.
Okay.
Councilmember Ashton.
Thank you. I think that if someone has extenuating circumstances, if they want to file via paper, I think they should be allowed to. So for this one, I'm not in favor of it, although I do think in practice most people will. I wanted to have some space for those who may not.
Okay, hearing nothing further, I will get to our 10th and last request.
Yeah, on behalf of, as a member of the BOS, Steve Fisher, member of the BOSC. The issue for us, if somebody gives us a report on paper, we're not CPAs. The current electronic version does all the calculations, summarizes everything, and we just have to determine whether section to section is consistent. If somebody says, I'm going to do a handwritten report that doesn't have to conform with the forms we already have, we don't have the wherewithal to sit there and go through all of this and tally it up and so forth. We're not paid for it, certainly. So that's a real concern on our part. The new system works great if people plug in the numbers the right way, but if they're doing it manually and not using the form, that creates a conundrum for us. So that's something the Mayor and Council have to think about too, in terms of the extent of the leeway you grant to anyone to submit something otherwise. Because if they're too full of sites and all of a sudden everyone's got problems, there's only 5 or maybe 7 of us, depending on how that goes, to resolve it, and there's 4 reports that we have to deal with. That's a lot. Thank you.
Okay, so we're up to our 10th and last suggestion, and that is, it's in section 81017, which describes the disclaimers that campaign materials are required to display. Our view has always been that language is inadequate. You can satisfy that requirement by putting on a campaign pamphlet authorized by and then the name of a campaign treasurer. I think that's not adequate. And what we would like is something comparable to the federal requirement, which is actually not that complicated. It's got to say 2 things: who paid for it and whether it's been authorized by the candidates committee. And it's got it, and there are rules about it being prominent and so on, but I think that's the information that the disclaimer ought to convey, and we would urge you to amend that section to include those requirements.
Following that up, according to the federal guidelines, you actually have to name the individual who's the treasurer, or just that it came from a particular campaign committee?
Well, it's Rockville's law that says you can name the treasurer, authorized by, let's say if Steve Fisher were somebody's treasurer, authorized by Steve Fisher, and of course the public looks at that and says, who the heck is Steve Fisher? Well, if he's not running for office.
Right,
I
mean, I'm trying to look for a solution to the T-shirt problem where you print out these T-shirts and all of a sudden you have a new treasurer. So if you don't actually have to name the treasurer.
No. It would say paid for by Priscilla for city council, authorized, and if it's not, then it would say whether it was authorized by the candidate or not. So, for example, sometimes, I work for labor unions, and they'll put out materials, and it'll say paid for by the workers group, not authorized by the candidate, or something like that. So it's 2 things: who paid for it, has it been authorized? All right. So I will conclude. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to discuss and explain these proposed changes. Before I finish, I really want to mention to you, and something that I'm sure is obvious, that we could not do what we do without the help and support of Sarah Taylor Farrell and Judy Penny. They have been they are absolutely tremendous. They've put in hours and hours of work on this, and we really, really appreciate it. Going forward, we would be happy to work with the city's attorney's office in drafting language to implement these changes, and I would say that in the weeks ahead, we will be happy to answer any questions you have about these or any aspect of our preparation for the election.
Councilmember Feinberg.
Yes, thank you. I know it's not
Thank you, Sarah. I know it's not in this sheet, but it is certainly a question. The idea of increasing the number of BOSC members from 5 to 7. If you could comment on that. I believe I read that it was the opinion of the BOSC not to do it now, that it could be a distraction from the work you all had to do.
Well, I mean, those are really two questions. How do we feel about having the BSE larger, and then do we want people now?
Right.
Okay. The answer to the first question is there's some logic to having more people on the BSE,
Agreed.
especially if there's going to be an additional vote center. So on election night, we have to be able to cover the voting center and then the counting center. So it's City Hall and the Montgomery County Board of Elections. If there's a second vote center, then we need two
Three
people at
places,
least
yeah.
at each
Right.
of those locations. So it would be helpful to have an additional member. But having said that, this job requires a lot of experience and training. I've been on the BSE for over 4 years, and I am still learning this job, and it's not something that's easy to learn in a short period of time. So which is why, and I don't want to veer off into an unrelated topic, we ask for the appointment of someone to fill vacancies with experience, who knows what they're doing, who knows how to canvass ballots, who knows how to duplicate ballots, who knows what goes on at the counting center on election day. So I don't look forward. Eventually, I think it would be helpful to have a larger group, but there's just not enough time to train somebody who's completely new between now and November 7th.
Councilmember
If I
Feinberg.
can continue. But some of the tasks, having been there, while they've changed over the years, some of them are pretty rote. Once you get the hang of it, you're on autopilot. And it would seem to me it would give you a backup, because if someone is sick or something happens, you don't have a critical mass that you can turn to. And I guess that's why I was wondering, wouldn't it be more prudent to go that route? I know it's a charter amendment, I believe. Isn't that right? If I'm seeing head shaking, right.
Right.
So I know it's not on this list, but I bring that up because it seems to me a wiser thing to do, and given the additional vote center and being over in Gaithersburg.
To be sure, there are some things that a new member could do without much in the way of training. So, for example, we need people to go around to the drop boxes
Right.
every day to retrieve the ballots.
Right.
I'm sure we could train somebody to do that. But on the other hand, that person, if you said to that person, supervise the canvassing of the ballots, I think that would be a unreasonable request to make of somebody new.
Right, but you could pick and choose with your experience, knowing how much effort and training. I still, it's my opinion that it would be better to get to the 7 now. And at least the new persons would get some orientation of it, so that 4 years from now, you have another cadre of people who are somewhat trained.
Well, yes, to be sure, there are things that we could assign to somebody new with that experience, but boy, it would sure be a lot more helpful to have somebody with actual experience. I think we're in agreement on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Ashton.
I just want to say, I know there's a lot of work just looking at ahead of what you all have to do. So thank you in advance, and thank you to DCO for the work that you're doing. I too think that either now or eventually we should start getting the process to expand, because as the city grows, hopefully we get a lot more ballots too, right? So there'll be more work to do, and I would love to get more people trained and maybe have alternates. I think that it's a very big job.
Right.
This is essential to the democracy of our city, and the function that you all do is so important. So I want to make sure you have good people.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Pacheco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I totally support going to 7. I think you're going to bring new people on now anyway. So it, hopefully experienced people will apply and be accepted, but if not, I would go for 7. And I know that the Board of Supervisors of Elections has experienced some turnover since the beginning of this term. And, for example, somebody moved out of the city, somebody was transferred, I think, things like that happen. And I really hate to see you, on election day with only a few people.
Right. I agree.
Okay,
Thank
thank you all
you.
very much for your attention.
Thank you.
I see a hand from Dr. Miles. 1 sec.
Oh.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just also want to associate myself with the comments of my colleagues with regard to expanding the Board of Supervisors of Elections. Thank you.
Mr. Kernick, thank you so much for your time tonight and the way you walked through all these recommendations. Very, very helpful. So thank you.
You are quite welcome. Thank you.
Madam Mayor and council members, we do need some clarifying direction on what the city attorney needs to bring back. So can we go over each of those, Robert? I'm sorry.
No.
But we do need some clarification.
You're not done.
So that he can bring everything back in the right form.
Sure.
Sure, I see Councilmember Ashton's hand up.
I think there are many of them that had a lot of nods. I think that
Right.
there were just a few that had questions, and that would be, colleagues help me out here, but the slates one is one that was a comment.
Monique, can you turn your mic on?
It's on, sorry, yes, I'm speaking in the mic a little closer now. So I think that just to help expedite us, it seemed like the definitions, election procedures, 41A and C, electioneering with the desire of maybe 50, or it might get a little more depending on what staff come back in terms of your expert opinion there. The one that had question was 8.872.
Right.
I've heard people were in favor of 874A and 77B, as well as with 878 contributions and expenses. Where I did see question was election reports, and also the prohibited practices, just wanting a little more clarity on that, but it seemed like people were open to that. So I think it's just the 3. If my colleagues want to weigh in on that.
And the process to expand the board.
Yes.
Okay.
Councilmember Pacheco and then Councilmember Feinberg.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. I thought 8-81 election reports, we decided not to require election filing by electronic election filing. That was my reading of the conversation.
To add something about a waiver.
No, I thought it was to not require electronic filing. That was my understanding, not just a waiver.
Okay.
Councilmember Feinberg.
I had been proposing that there'd be a waiver, so that VSOE could make the determination in certain situations to give a waiver from the electronic filing. That was what I had proposed.
I think Mr. Fitcher made a very astute point about, how it all works. And for those of you who've done the electronic filings, you know that everything is just run down the list and it balances out at the end, or it doesn't. So I think we would want as many people to file electronically as possible. And if someone needed a waiver, then that would be the way to go. Councilmember Ashton.
So I think we also just need to clarify, what does that waiver look like? Because the BOSC is not hanging around the DCO all the time. And for the deadline, what would how would they still meet the deadline if something happened with their computer or an issue? That needs to be clear.
Well, as campaign finances are due, we're always ready to meet at any time. That's one of the board's charges, is that whenever campaign finances are due, we meet more often to review. So if someone needed to have a waiver, we could call a meeting, especially in virtual now.
Councilmember Purcell.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I understand better now. I'm okay with the waiver. I think maybe put in some language that would encourage the candidate or the treasurer to come in and fill it in electronically on site if necessary, or at least offer that possibility. Or once the power's back on, or once the space aliens go away, right? Okay.
Councilmember Pfeiffer.
Yes, I think the other thing, the other item I had mentioned was getting a line item budget for the election. It's not from the city attorney's office, but that would be something that I specifically asked for, so that we'd know for the 24 election where we are.
Yes, we'll take care of that.